Well, Loreena, thank you so much for taking time to talk to you interview today. We're so pleased to have you. We're big fans of your music.
Thank you. It's great to be with you this afternoon.
So first off, I know you have the re-release of The Visit. It is the 30th anniversary. Talk a little bit about what this anniversary means to you and what the album meant to you.
Well, it's always a sobering exercise when one looks back in their life, no matter what you do, I think. And certainly within the trajectory of my career, it's been fascinating in some ways. It's not always comfortable, but let's say to see what I was thinking of, what were the themes that were on my mind, and why, how I expressed those themes in the recording itself. There are things that I probably would like to try to do over again. There's all of that. But I think it is an interesting exercise in terms of measuring where you've traveled from and where you are now and going to. So on the most part, it's been quite gratifying. And I think one of the greatest parts is that when we've been working on this project over the past year, we've been able to work with people who were in situ with me for The Visit in 1991. They include Brian Hughes, or the engineer Jack Wolpert. There was a senior vice president of Warner Music Canada, Dave Tollington, and also the graphic designer, Jerry. But anyway, Jerry, who's from Los Angeles.
Yeah. So tell us a little, take us back there. What was your headspace back then? And what was sort of the mood that you were in when you were creating this album?
Well, it was an interesting time in my career. I had started out making my first recording in 1985, and I'd spent 5-6 years building my career brick by brick. Really, I made my first release in 85, and then another one in 87 and 89, and started putting myself on tour across Canada over those years in a very grassroots kind of effort, and setting up distribution myself through either directly through small retailers or through specialty distributors. So as a result of the success of my third recording, Parallel Dreams, in 1989, this caught the attention of the various major record companies here in Canada. So it was a crossover. It was my first recording that was where I was able to join forces with a major record company, which was the Warner Music Group. It was initially made available in Canada, but within about 3 or 4 months, it was made available internationally. And so it was a real crossover time. I remember a moment when I did a showcase in Toronto, and it was for the regular the media and the radio and the retailers. And I realized that night when I came away that my life was about to change. Up until that time, I'd been ferreting away as this relatively local individual with her little career, and that things were about to make a shift. So there was some excitement, but also trepidation with that. Creatively, also that fall, I had attended a wonderful exhibition in Venice. That was the most extensive exhibition ever held on the Celts. And I remember that was a pretty exciting dimension. But when I look at the themes that I was working on in this recording, it was really an extension of particularly the third recording, Parallel Dreams. I was wondering how well my songwriting and lyric writing would relate to people, because I had always felt that maybe I was more of a traditional singer, an artist. So it was this certain amount of insecurity that I went into this recording, as I had the previous one, writing more. So that's a little bit what's on my mind.
Yeah, I'm interested in that because your music is often thought of as being sort of Celtic in feel. What was it that brought that about this exhibit that you brought into the music at that time? Was it something new that it brought to the music, or was it something that existed there previously?
No, a lot of the inspiration for the pieces that are on the visit were largely what had happened prior to that. So, for example, I had been traveling to Ireland since about 1981. So by the time 1991 arrived, or 1990, 91, when I was working the visit, I'd seen a decade of changes. So when I was writing a piece like The Old Ways, what was on my mind was, I'm seeing a transition of a culture. I'm seeing some of those old traditions perhaps fade away or diminish in some way. And I was reflecting a bit on the loss of that. Or let's say the Cymbeline track, which is a section of Shakespeare's that I put to music. Well, when I moved to Stratford, where I live now, Stratford, Ontario, there's a Shakespearean theatre modeled after the one in England. And I worked here at the theatre for 4 years and was living and breathing Shakespeare a lot. And so gravitating to some of Shakespeare's works, which had a Celtic connection, because in Cymbeline it has that connection. I thought that would be a good piece to set to music. So these are just samples of some of the stories behind the songs.
Sure. Now, talk about specifically on the album, what were some of the most important songs to you and why?
Yeah, it's quite an, I would say, Bonnie Portmore is one that has really, even though it's regarded as a traditional piece, it is one that has really struck with me, and I know resonated for many, many people around the world. I think largely for me, the attraction was its connection to trees. And the Celts had a great reverence for trees. In fact, they had established an alphabet that was referenced from the different qualities of the trees. And now in this day and age, we see how vital trees and the portfolio of plants, how vital trees are to our survival. And there was something that I was really tapping into in that piece, in terms of bringing this historical point of view into a contemporary relevance. I mentioned The Old Ways earlier. When I think also, let's say, of The Lady of Shalott, when I think of the lineage of that song.
Yeah, please talk about that song, because it's a lot of people's favorites. So give us some color about how that song was written and what the inspirations were.
Well, I'm not sure how many of your listeners are familiar with a wonderful set of books called Anne of Green Gables, but in Canada they're a very, very famous set of children and youth stories. And there was Anne of Green Gables was set in Prince Edward Island, a young girl with red hair, and quite adventuresome, you might say. I read it and I loved that book, but I actually never remembered the fact that the Lady of Shalott is buried in the narrative in that story. So I expect it was kind of embedded in my psyche until I was, further down the line when I was working on the visit. But again, I was looking for material that would have some Celtic connection, and I felt that the era of King Arthur qualified in that loose kind of way. I also respected the fact that in the Celtic tradition, they wrote nothing down. Theirs was a very oral tradition. So I thought, well, then let's have a long poem, shall we? And even at that, I edited quite a number of verses out of the Lady of Shalott. And then sat down to set it to music. And I remember sitting at the piano in the back of this old farmhouse that I was renting in those days. And really, it's an exercise that was more like channeling that English countryside through the melody, but also trying to reflect the tension of the story through the minor and the major modes, trying to evoke the imagery that was in the poem. For me personally, my most favorite section is actually the verse that talks about the reapers reaping early. As someone who grew up in the prairies of Canada and working on a farm doing manual labor, it was something I really related to in a very fond way where you are at one with the elements. I think of a piece like Tango to Evora, which is an oddball kind of lineage. I was commissioned to compose music for a set of films out of the National Film Board of Canada. It was called Women in Spirituality. And that melody was something I composed for that series. And that was in the sort of about 87, 88. And so when I came around to recording The Visit, I was looking around for a place to start on some things. And I thought, well, why don't I take that melody and do something with it? And Évora or Evora is actually a city in Portugal. And when we were on the photo shoot in Portugal for The Visit, the photographer and I went and took a little trip to Évora, and we were listening to the track on the way. So that was kind of, and what the other thing that's interesting about that track, it's been covered actually by quite a number of artists from other places like Greece and Turkey and Israel and Iran and so on. Trying to think what else is on it. You know, the Green Sleeves track was an accidental track that came from a kind of research exercise that Polygram put me on in 1988, an artist development deal. And in that situation, we were in the studio and the engineer had to take a telephone call. And Brian, my guitarist, and I think the bass player, myself, were on the floor. And I said, well, I'd be interested to know how Tom Waits would do, how he would perform at Green Sleeves. So I started playing around with that. And the engineer got off the phone. He said, that sounds interesting. Why don't you go and do that from the top, and I'll just press the record button. So that's how that, I would love to say that the recordings, the pieces are much more methodically developed and assembled. They end up being this really eclectic hodgepodge of pieces. But when I'm working, I try to establish a title very early on, and then the songs need to always relate to that title. So they're like spokes on an umbrella.
So were you surprised at all? I mean, your music, as you said, it's very sort of cultural and cerebral. And were you surprised that this sort of music gained such a mass following?
Absolutely. I was really very surprised. And I wasn't quite sure what it was, I mean, I became attracted to the Celtic music when I was a part of a folk club in Winnipeg in the late 70s. And I mean, not just attracted, I really felt like I was addicted to it. And there was something very infectious in the Celtic music itself that I've witnessed the world over. Many the artists and groups who are working in the Celtic music are finding that it has attraction in the craziest places. So I came to realize over the years I was already trading in a very infectious musical genre, the Celtic. Then I wondered, well, I like the idea of mixing up the arrangements. And certainly once I started pursuing the history of the Celts, after learning that they were this collection of tribes that had fanned out across Europe and into Asia Minor, that gave me the license to weave in many more idioms and genres of, whether it's Middle Eastern or. So the music became quite eclectic, and I wondered, well, maybe the combination of the Celtic and the eclectic is what's appealing to people. And so we then kind of joked around and said, well, it's eclectic Celtic then. But then I appreciate there may be a quality in my voice that, when you add that ingredient in, it all comes together in something that works for some folks.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about your process. I mean, when you're sitting down, how has it evolved for you over the 30 years? When you go to sit down to write something, what's different today than it was? I mean, obviously there's a lot more experience, there's a lot more behind it, but what's different for you?
It's not a lot different. It's still this kind of hodgepodge type of experience. I mean, what's different is that I have more resources. let's say, financial resources to bring in a wide array of musicians and instruments and have a much wider palette of colors and textures to work with. And we've recorded at Peter Gabriel's studio and at Real World since about '94, and have been privileged enough to tap into his, his Rolodex of contacts of people. So that probably is the most distinctive factor, that I was able to go from, drawing upon a small, very, very accomplished group of people to a larger, very accomplished group of artists. But from the standpoint that I often go into the studio not having everything written, and that is very unnerving, because you have to commit to this time and you've got a big financial gun to your head. And I think even with the Book of Secrets, I was already in the studio recording some pieces that I was still working on the Mummers Dance, which went on to be a considerable hit. So, and that has not changed. And I think that's partially or largely because most of my time is not functioning as an artist. I manage my own career. I never had a manager, and some would say I'm unmanageable. They're probably right. But a lot of my time gets spent managing my career and managing, producing things, producing tours and so on. So that too has changed. I manage things from the very beginning, but it's a much bigger enterprise now.
Yeah. So people, you're often mentioned in the same breath as Enya for that sort of sound. Does that comparison make you crazy, or do you like that the comparison? You think it's after?
Not terribly. No. I in some ways it's a compliment. I have great respect for Enya and her team's work and what they've accomplished over the years. They too are kind of trading a bit in that infectious Celtic territory. But I think for my part, I feel I've, whether I intended it or not, or wanted it or not, I've ended up walking my own unique musical path. And that I think that's been largely led by my curiosity. Many people probably know already that I never dreamed about being a singer. I always wanted to be a veterinarian. And if I hadn't gone on to be a veterinarian, I would have worked in forestry or wildlife conservation. So I've always had this arm's length distance psychologically with my career. I've never had a big appetite or infatuation for fame. I accept that it comes with it, but I feel incredibly grateful to have had some talent, but also landed in a career path that's afforded me some success to be able to travel the world, to meet people, to learn about cultures, and weave that back into my work. So it's been a very, very good loop.